Good evening. My name is Eric Wishart. I'm the first Vice President of the FCC Hong Kong. I'm also a journalist with the AFP News Agency. And it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you and to welcome a very special guest, Elizabeth Becker, who's just written a book about three remarkable war correspondents who not only had to face the challenges of covering combat, but also had to face the kind of sexism that women reporters today still suffer, but suffered even worse probably back in the 60s. And so Elizabeth's going to have a slideshow to start. I'd just like to tell you a bit about her. Elizabeth, I read your book and you were quite modest because it's only when you get to the end you suddenly discover this crazy stuff you did in Cambodia. You were in Phnom Penh before the Khmer Rouge took over. Then you went on a kind of bizarre guided tour under the Khmer Rouge. You interviewed Pol Pot, and then you later testified in the International War Crimes Tribunal. So you've got quite a story to tell. I'd like to go back to that. You also wrote a book about it called When the War Was Over. Elizabeth's award-winning journalist. As I said, she began her career as a war correspondent for the Washington Post in Cambodia, just slightly after the period, I think, that the three women war correspondents we're going to talk about tonight. She later became the senior foreign editor for National Public Radio and a New York Times correspondent covering national security and foreign policy. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including accolades from the Overseas Press Club, DuPont Columbia's awards, and was a member of the Times team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for covering 9/11. Quite a recent story. She's also the author of two previous books, When the War Was Over, Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge Revolution, which I would definitely recommend. I mean, it's a fascinating story. And the definitive book on the event that has been in the print for 20 years, actually. Yep. And Overbooked, slightly different topic, the exploding business of travel and tourism, an expose of the travel industry, which is suffering at the moment. And I mean, we've got, the three women, and of course, we celebrated International Women's Day yesterday, so the timing's very good. The three women correspondents we're talking about is Frances FitzGerald, who came from quite a privileged background in the United States, Catherine Leroy, a photographer from France, and Kate Webb, who was a dearly loved member of the FCC, and also a very close colleague of mine in AFP from like 1987 right up to her retirement. So this is somebody I know very well, a legend, as we all know. So I think, Elizabeth, welcome. And I think we have, for those of you who've signed up, you can submit questions. So we look forward to hearing from you. But Elizabeth, I think you're going to start with showing us a slideshow to kind of give us an idea of the really remarkable work that these three women did in very difficult circumstances.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. And it's wonderful to be here, particularly because my book opens in Hong Kong, of all places, because Kate Webb met me there on my way to Cambodia, where I was going to try to be a war correspondent. So thank you. Let's start with the slide. So I want to give you a taste of the book, give you a feeling for the era, and give you the images, in fact, because we are talking about an amazing war that is still relevant. Can I have the first slide, please? So here's the book. And I want to just say at the top is Catherine Leroy, the French photojournalist who arrived in Saigon with one Leica camera around her neck. And she became renowned for her work taking intimate and humane photographs of the war. And she later became the first woman to win prestigious awards like the George Polk Award for Photography and the Robert Capa Gold Medal Award. The next woman is Frances FitzGerald, again, the incredibly privileged American who filled a huge void in the war coverage by looking at the war from the Vietnamese point of view, which seems obvious today, but she was the only one doing it then. She wrote a book on that subject, which was the most honored of the war. And below that is Kate Webb, the the friend of Eric's, and as he said, in her time, a legend. Next, please. Next slide, please.
Okay.
There we are. This is Katrine in the battlefield. I want you to see how small she is. She's barely 5 feet and she's weighing 87 pounds. She's with the Americans. She practically lived in the battlefield because her reception back in Saigon was mixed at best. She was told that she didn't belong there. It was a man's war and women should not be on the field. She was accused of trying to act like a man. Next slide, please. And she showed them just what her talents were. She was rebellious. She was rebellious against her petite bourgeois Catholic upbringing. So she dropped out of high school and learned how to jump parachutes over the Burgundy landscape. That came in handy when the United States had its first, and it turned out only, air assault. Katrine was the only journalist, male, female, writer, or photographer, vaguely qualified. So she was the only one who jumped with the 173rd. Here she is just before she's getting on the airplane. Next slide, please. And these are her photographs. Think of this, that diminutive young woman is jumping from the airplane with 3 cameras around her neck. She's trying to follow the airborne soldiers, jumping down and taking these marvelous photographs. She lands in a combat zone and follows them. It takes courage and skill and I don't know, a magic touch. These are the kind of photographs that, go ahead, Eric.
Yes, okay. I mean, this is just amazing stuff. I mean, can you, I mean, even being on the ground in a war zone is something, but doing this, and also I think you say in the book she needed like ballast or something because she was so light they were worried she was going to get blown away. I mean, yes. how did she manage to persuade? I mean, she was a woman. It was a war zone. I mean, even trying to get access was difficult. How did she persuade them to take her up in a plane and let her jump in a parachute with the troops?
Well, she had this marvelous ability of pushing herself forward and convincing people. And then when she got the opportunity, becoming nearly invisible. So I'll show you a couple of other pictures that resemble it. And she learned how to use her credentials. This is one of the few skills she had, and she was not going to let this opportunity pass. So yes, it's marvelous. That's why I led the book with it. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an example of how close she got. You can see the faces of the Marines who are carrying their wounded comrade away from the battle. Everything's going on, of course, mortars, etc. And the soldier, the Marine is dying, and Katrine was able to get it, and this is her hallmark, getting close. Next slide, please. This is a medic. The Battle of the Hills, one of the most horrific. Katrine is in the middle, sliding in the mud, going up close to him. Twilight, she does not use any extra light. She wants to get the light perfect. She takes a series of photographs and they become published around the world. When the medics saw the photographs, he said, "Where was she? I didn't see her. She was that skilled." Next slide, please. And this is the classic Katrine photograph. A soldier waiting for war. He's not heroic per se. It's not a classic heroic, but you see his humanity and his heroism just sitting there waiting. Next slide, please. And of course, the people. She, like the other two women, had a wide lens, so to speak. And her photographs included exactly how this war was, tearing apart the whole country. And this is, of course, a woman and the children escaping the battle. Next slide, please. And this man in the middle of the photograph is the Associated Press photography chief named Horst Voss. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer himself. And he, among all the men, was open to Katrine. He said he would buy photographs from anyone if the photographs were good, even if a woman took them. Now that's normal now, but then he was alone in that kind of attitude. And he, in a sense, he mentored him. He ensured that her photographs were sent along just as the men were. And he noted exactly how unusual they were. At one point, he said he hadn't seen photographs like this since World War II. And even though she was a difficult handful, he kept pushing her through, and that's how she won the awards. So there were male heroes here.
You say she was a difficult handful. She wasn't
Yes.
easy.
No, and part of it was her personality, but part of it was her treatment, because the men were so against her that they went behind her back at one point and connived with some U.S. military spokesman to have her credentials taken away, which was completely under the table. There was no reason to take them away. They wanted to take them away because they thought she was coarse and too pushy, of course, which the men all were. And she got them back, but after that, she was very, very wary of a lot of her colleagues. And she had a hard time telling her friends from her enemies sometimes.
And one thing I noted in your book, Elizabeth, was that you said that Horst Voss gave her the chance. And he says, once you've taken your photographs, he told her, bring back the film and AP will develop it in the Bureau's darkroom. Photographers receive $15 for every photo purchased by AP, and AP retains the copyright on all these photos. No discussion.
He was a German. What can I say? No, Horst was beloved. Horst was beloved by everybody because he treated everybody the same way. I mean, that's it. And AP, of course, loved him. And and not only that, he also was a champion of the local Vietnamese photographers. And so anyway, next slide, please. Now, this is Frances FitzGerald, and she's almost like a character out of Great Gatsby. Her family was a family of immense wealth, privilege. She was chauffeured to her private school in England when she lived there. She always had horses in stables and servants, and honors graduate from Radcliffe. But for all of that privilege, she was still a woman, and she couldn't get a serious job. When she tried to get a writer's job in Newsweek magazine, she was told, no, women are only qualified to be researchers. So this is the era we're talking about. All these three women had to pay their own way. None of them had jobs. They had to pay their own way. They had to find work when they got there, and they had to figure out how to operate in that kind of situation. Now, she obviously had a nice fat bank account, so she didn't have to worry on the money side, but she still had to worry on the female side. So she did 100% freelance, long form magazine. She ended up writing for some of the best and some of the most amazing, different kind of journalism, particularly from a war point of view. Next slide, please. This is her credential. I always love to look at those. She would go to the rear guard to report battle a bit, but she was interested in the country. So she, for instance, at the end of one of the bigger battles, instead of going down to Saigon to type up her notes or send a piece, to begin a piece, she went to civilian hospitals to see how poorly the civilians were being treated, and it was abysmal. I mean, in fact, because of her closeted kind of upbringing, she was appalled at the misery she saw, appalled. And she started writing articles that had never been seen before, about villages as they were being torn apart by specific war policies to deny the enemy soldiers. She wrote about the slums of Saigon instead of the sort of ins and outs of US foreign policy per se. And she wrote that she wrote, excuse me, very deep analysis of why the US policy wasn't working. Her dad was number 3 in the CIA, and her mother was the mistress of Adlai Stevenson, a former presidential candidate. And so she knew she was not intimidated by top policymakers, and she dug deeply, immersed herself in the story, and came up saying, the United States can't win this because they're being seen as a colonial power. That led to her book, Fire in the Lake, published in 1972, which won every major prize you could win and remains one of the most honored books about Vietnam. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit of the way she writes. From our helicopter, the land looks sculptured by history, as constant as the motion of water. But in the military parlance, the village is insecure, isolated by war. The American and South Vietnamese, with their radios, trucks, and the airplanes, have altered the villagers' sense of time and space. Their very numbers and the vast power of their machines have distorted the human proportion and the scale of possibilities for the villagers. Still work with hand pulleys and bullock carts. They have uprooted farmers, pushing them over the edge of their old lives and onto the road to swell the tide of people, washing wave upon wave out of the seething war. That's one of her first articles. New York Times Magazine, September 1966, prescient. Next slide, please. I think we'll pass on this one.
Okay. Why? It's okay.
Okay, well.
Downward spiral.
This is the downward spiral from Fire in the Lake. So you have a sense of the book. The masses of Vietnamese people resented the French no more and no less than they resented the Americans. It was the Viet Minh who focused that resentment. The fact was that many Vietnamese of the cities had wanted the Americans to intervene, had wanted them to intervene not only for practical reasons, but for psychological ones. They wanted the Americans to be the all-powerful barbarians, to take responsibility for the war. At the same time, they feared American domination. By one of those strange reverses that the mind makes for the sake of self-consistency, both the desire and the fear merged in the expression of fear that the Americans would leave them. The more Americans spent their best efforts in their lives in Vietnam, the less influence they had to reform the government of South Vietnam. With both men and material resources, the Americans were enforcing corruption and destroying the tissue of Vietnamese society.
Was there anything, Elizabeth, comparable to that being written at that time?
Not at that time. We're now going crazy here.
Go by. That's okay. Okay, Benny.
That's fine. Thank you, Benny. No, and later there's criticism that she didn't really understand the Vietnamese so well, blah blah blah. But no, this was it. And one of the consistent themes of all the reviews of the book is, thank goodness someone finally is telling us what's going on in Vietnam and just not what's going on in the minds of the policymakers in Washington and the battlefields. Americans did not know Vietnam. Now, you Europeans, particularly the French, of course, had grown up with Indochina. But so this was a breakthrough. And we didn't even have tenured professors at that stage of teaching Vietnam. Next, please. Okay, and this is the last slide on Frankie. She's obviously the only woman there. After the peace accords were signed in '73, she was one of the first journalists to go and see what the Viet Cong looked like from the other side. And she ended up being one of the rare journalists who actually covered every side of the war, including North Vietnam. Next slide, please. Kate Webb. This is such a famous photograph. You see it every time the Kate Webb Award Prize is given out. often in Hong Kong. And
I saw the stamp, Elizabeth, in Australia.
yes, yes, and the stamp in Australia. So, Kate was, just to give a little idea, she had a troubled background. She came from a wonderful family of intellectuals, born in New Zealand, moved to Australia where her dad was a professor. But in her teens, she witnessed her best friend commit suicide, and she was temporarily implicated. Then a few years later, after she recovered from that, both of her parents were killed in an automobile accident. So by the time she's out of college and sort of trying to figure out what to do with life, she finds a temporary job in the Mirror in Sydney, Mirror newspaper, notices carrying the copy around from desk to desk, what we would call a copy boy in the United States. She becomes interested in the fact that Australia was fighting a war with the Americans in Vietnam. She doesn't have a lot to lose, so she picks up her typewriter, buys a one-way ticket, and goes to Vietnam. Next slide, please. And this is her. She's unlike the others who sort of figured out their own way of doing things. Katrine going off and becoming a particular kind of photographer, Frankie going off and and really concentrating on the Vietnam. Kate tried to be one of the guys. You see, her hair was long when she first went. She cut it short. She was always in pants. She was always in the battlefield. She had a hard time at first convincing any American media to hire her. She was Australian, but because of her coverage, in particular of the Tet Offensive in 1968, she found a job with United Press International wire service, which is a very demanding, very quick-witted kind of job. She took the stuff no one else would take. She would go on night operations with the South Vietnamese army. Nothing stopped her. And she also became much closer, and this is a theme of all three women, much closer to the South Vietnamese, both the civilians and the military. And then later, when she goes to Cambodia, she became much closer to the Cambodians. So she had, from the get-go, a deep identity with the countries where she's working. And she attributed that, I think, a lot to her upbringing. Both of her parents, as New Zealand Australians, felt that their countries had to recognize and respect the community of Asian countries that they were part of. Next slide, please.
And you know, Elizabeth, that
yeah,
I mean, from my experience of Kate and AFP, she was always a massive supporter of local staff, you know.
Yes.
And you referred to the Kate Webb Prize that we brought in after her death, and it recognizes courageous reporting by local Asian staff. So, I mean, I think so it's interesting to hear what you say, that from a very early days in her sort of Vietnam coverage already, she was very kind of committed and involved with the local people, which of course you should be, but yeah.
We're not. In fact, when I did my research in Australia, and I got to spend a lot of time with her wonderful sister, Rachel Miller, I found all of her notebooks, and she was, quotes, one of the guys, but then she'd go back home and write just how awful they'd been to her. And so during her time in Saigon, her best friend was her Vietnamese landlady. I mean, that's what it was. So here's just a little bit.
In Cambodia and in Phnom Penh, obviously, she, as you say in the book, she had a relationship with a Cambodian, which was looked down on in these days, right?
Absolutely. And I want to just give you a taste of the way she wrote. This is Life and Death of a Helicopter Crew. This is 1968, when most wire service reporters did not write personally about the war. There are times when the Vietnam War makes a reporter's fingers shake while holding a pencil. My pencil wobbles as I write the story of two young helicopter gunners I knew briefly as Smitty and Mac. I saw them go to war many times. Now I have seen their bodies come back. In the days before that Thursday, I rode with them as they flew out again and again over the jungles. They lived the ordeal of those military words: resupply, medevac, close fire support, troop lift. It was a special routine of life and death. It started each time with the pilot's stick coming up, the door gunner's visor sliding down over their eyes. High over the green jungle, wind tears at our clothes and flattens your face. The impersonal Army war report saying the helicopter crashed and burned. All 4 crew members killed in action. Now that's the kind of emotion and really close observation that you might get in a magazine piece. This is a wire service story. And she was unrelenting. She was going to bring all of those skills to the fore when she was writing on war coverage. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is her famous, I had to put this in. This is what got her job. So she's, this is the Tet Offensive. The American officials have been telling everybody, we're just about to win the war. And Kate was one of the first to see the Viet Cong that had taken over the US Embassy's lower grounds. And she wrote
I think,
this,
Elizabeth, you say in the book, I think she'd just arrived, no?
Yeah, well, no, she'd been there for a few months. She'd been there for a few months.
Okay.
Right. So she wrote, it was like a butcher shop in Eden. At the white walled embassy, the green lawns and white ornamental fountains were strewn with bodies. The teak door was blasted. The weary defenders were pickaxing their way warily among the dead and around live rockets. This is a woman who just started becoming a reporter. And this quote is in nearly every book that covers Vietnam. I mean, she was extraordinary. She was smart. I mean, Frankie was smart. This woman was smart. It was amazing. Next slide, please. And this has to be preambled with Kate going to Cambodia. So she did very well. She had a personal setback. And when she returned to Indochina, they put her as number 2 in Cambodia because the war had just expanded to 1970 to Cambodia. It was horrendously difficult. In the first 4 months of that war, as many journalists were killed as the previous 6 years in Vietnam. It was crazy. The United States had invaded the North Vietnamese, hoping to get the North Vietnamese out of Cambodia and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Instead, the North Vietnamese went straight into the country. And if you can't follow that history, you can imagine what it was doing to the journalists and the people on the ground. So Kate, one of the journalists killed in those first 4 months was Kate's boss. He died, and UPI made Kate the bureau chief. I cannot tell you how amazing that is. Women at that stage were not considered good enough to be foreign correspondents, much less war correspondents. And the idea that in the middle of this really live combat area, a woman would be made bureau chief was astounding. But everybody kept it on the low because you never knew whether there would be backlash. In Vietnam, there was almost backlash and the women were almost taken off the battlefield. So Kate, there's no big press release, Kate Webb, a woman is finally a bureau chief, none of that. But by then, her byline, a woman's byline, was finally reaching the consciousness of people, of particularly news editors around the world. This is 1970. Well, her luck ran out 1 year later, and she was captured by the North Vietnamese in Cambodia. And she was held for 23 days. And I love this interrogation by the North Vietnamese who believe she's a spy. Why did you choose that particular morning to go down highway 4? Kate answers, I wish I hadn't in a way. On the other hand, it's given me the first opportunity of my life to meet you. The government announced the operation. It was my job to see what was really happening. And the guy says, we find it unbelievable that you would go down the highway, which is very dangerous, alone in your car, just looking for the truth. She writes, that made it sound pretty silly, looking for a rare flower on the battlefield. Everyone knows there's no truth on the battlefield, except getting killed, getting out alive, and the unenviable in-between of being maimed. Sometimes I think my job is crazy myself, I said ruefully. Isn't that Kate? Eric?
And Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to read it now. And, Elizabeth, I mean, you have to put it in context. I mean, I'm going to quote from your book. I noted this, really. You said in Cambodia, the casualty rate rose astronomically. 22 foreign journalists were killed or were missing and presumed dead in the first 4 months of the Cambodian campaign. That nearly matched the casualty rate of 24 journalists killed for the entire 6 years of the Vietnam War. Cambodia became known as the shooting gallery. You said in a single week, 9 journalists working for American television networks were killed. I mean, this was the killing field for journalists, wasn't it?
It was. And Vietnam was fully American war. The Americans had the helicopters. You had your press card. You could get on a helicopter, a tank, and you knew that you could also get back, and that if you're injured, you had the American hospitals, military or civilian or French hospitals. In Cambodia, none of that. It had been a neutral country through all of the war up until 1970. And there was no infrastructure. So you had Khmer Rouge, North Vietnamese, Lon Nol's very green army, the Cambodian government army, and American support, which was because of Congress' fury that the war had been expanded rather than diminished. They only had air support, and it was hard to tell. And even when I got there a few years later, it was you really had a hard time figuring out how you're going to get the right intelligence so you could go to the battlefield and come back safely. Next slide, please. Okay, so she this is Kate. So she comes back alive after 23 days. While she was away, she had been declared dead. There was a mistaken identity of a corpse, a woman's corpse. I think it was her. So when she got out, Australia went crazy. I looked at the archives of her, every front page. Ark Alfred, she says the Reds are human beings just like the others. It was as triumphant as the end of World War II. And here she is crashing the press club, which was all male, and she's the first woman in. She and the other women did not subscribe to women's liberation, and that was a very important part of the theme of the era. They did not want to be seen as women or girl reporters, as they were called, which was like an inferior category. They rejected any attempt to treat them differently, and they suffered for it. But in this case, Kate was reveling in it, that she was crashing, and this is in Australia. Next slide, please. So I was there too, as Eric just said. This is the young woman that Kate met and helped me in my first few days. I'm there in January 73. There are only 2 more years of war. And as I said, Kate met me at the airport. I had Frances FitzGerald's book in my backpack. I was literally walking in their footsteps. And all of us women appreciated that. There were few of us, maybe in the 10 years, 70 women who were actual resident foreign war correspondents in the larger Indochina War. And for instance, most of my time in Cambodia, I was the only woman. Next slide, please. There we are. This is the Cambodian man in the middle is Long Barrett, who was the prime minister. This is after a so-called victory, and they had the press come. And the day the Khmer Rouge came in, he refused to leave the country, and he was one of the top leaders who was beheaded on the tennis court. Next slide, please. And this is what the Cambodian War looked like as compared to the Vietnamese. Monks, the smaller wheel, not the larger wheel. Monks in front of tanks. Next slide, please. Boy soldiers. The Cambodian War was very different than the Vietnamese. The corruption was more obvious. There was plenty of money to have equipment for soldiers. Instead, there's this little boy. The savagery was immediate on both sides. We saw so many mutilated bodies. It was hideous. Next slide, please. And that's the story I hope you want to read in When the War in You Don't Belong Here. I almost said the wrong title.
Thanks, Benny.
Thank you, Benny.
Compelling. I want to ask you, Elizabeth, when you went to Cambodia, do you think that the fact that Kate Webb and Catherine Rewrote and Frances FitzGerald had been in Vietnam, did that open anything up for you going in as a woman, even just a few years later? Do you think there was more acceptance? I mean, just generally in the male press corps, or were you subjected to that kind of sexism as well?
Well, they had pioneered institutionally, and this is the important part. Australia, until the very end of the war, refused to allow women on the battlefield. But Catherine Lewan, a few other women, managed to talk the Americans into no longer banning women from the battlefield, and that was historic. They didn't want to publicize it. They didn't tell their story for 30 years, because in those days, if you were triumphant, oh yay, celebrating that women got to do X, Y, and Z, there's often a backlash, as we know from anything, one step forward, 5 steps back. So they completely changed institutionally. And because Kate and others were writing, it was no longer impossible for a woman to write. And then thirdly, this was a huge war for the United States. The media, everybody was hungry for things. And as the guy who hired me said, I was the only one vaguely qualified to cover Cambodia for the Washington Post and Newsweek. And that's because they couldn't afford to have a resident correspondent themselves. So as the war expanded and the need was more, they relied on stringers, and it was no longer, I only found out later that I was the first woman to ever cover a war for the Washington Post, but it was all, you didn't talk that way. You kept it low. So yes, there's no question. We all owed our ability to be there. Had the men changed a lot? Not so much.
Looking at the book title, you say You Don't Belong Here. Okay. Can you maybe elaborate? I mean, how did that manifest itself?
Well, Katrine got it the worst. Remember, she and Frankie were there at the beginning, 1966, and Katrine was the only woman doing combat photography. A few months earlier, Dickie Chappelle, a famous woman photographer from just after World War II, she had come to take photographs. And it was a big deal because, wow, a woman was in combat. Well, she was killed within weeks after she arrived. That photograph of her crumpled body with the Marines went around the world, and it made it even harder for women to be considered qualified for it. So Katrine was literally told, you don't belong here. Don McCullum, who is a great gentleman and a lovely, fabulous photographer, he said, it was our attitude. We did not want to see women on the battlefield. Get out of here. Don't belong here. And Peter Arnett in his memoir is very honest about it. Women didn't belong there. Men covered men fighting war, and we did not help them if they got into trouble. The only interest we had in them was, to gossip about their love life. And their accomplishments were belittled. I mean, if you read their memoirs, women were just decoration, more or less.
I have a question from Jennifer Deaton. She said, many thanks for taking my question. Your work is extraordinary. After your own experiences in Cambodia, it seems like you'd be well aware of the women in your book and what they went through. But did you find yourself surprised by anything in your research? Did anything surprise you researching this book? About everything. It was,
thank you for that answer, that question. I mean, I couldn't believe it. we show just so much of ourselves, and so we'd say one story to another person, and but fortunately I lucked out because this is the days when people wrote letters. This is the days when people jotted things in their notebook, when they confided, and so on and so forth. And I was very much forced myself to push while witnesses were still alive. And several of the people who I interviewed, in fact, have died before the book has been published. And so there were levels to their lives I was shocked at. And I found stuff out that even Kate's family didn't know. And
what kind of things?
The easiest thing is her sister keeps all of her things in these wonderful plastic tubs, and I hope she puts them in a university soon. And we were going through, other people had been trying to write about Kate, and so I was not the first researcher, but I was the one who knew her best, blah, blah, blah. And I found what Kate had called her attempted novel. Well, I said, Rachel, this is no novel. I know everybody in this story. This is the story. This is her memoir, and she's barely disguised the names. I mean, in some instances, it was it was ridiculous, and we had an amazing time going through that, and stuff that Rachel didn't know, and she didn't know if she wanted to know, and then adding things up was the other thing that surprised. Frances FitzGerald had been asked to put all of her things into her archives at Boston, excuse me, and interviewing, you put 1 and 1 and you get 2 instead of 6. And so you put a timeline together that they hadn't realized and that you didn't realize. And the funnest part was to discover that all 3 were so committed to the war that they made sure that they were at the end. And that made an amazing end to the book.
One thing that really jumped out at me amongst all the rest of it was the fact that, you compared, you talked about Frances FitzGerald, and you talked about the Great Gatsby, and she shared the common name there. And she went back from Vietnam. She went to Truman Capote's black and white ball in New York. This is just insane. Truman Capote had just published In Cold Blood. He had a lot of money. He wanted to be socially accepted, and he threw this, what he called the black and white ball in New York. He dedicated it to, it was New York, he dedicated it to Catherine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. And then suddenly she finds herself in the middle of this and just can't quite, she ran into Robert McNamara, right?
Right.
Talk about that. That was just such a weird juxtaposition. And it also showed, I think, that when you've been in Vietnam in the mud, being catapulted into that is really difficult.
Well, yeah, and all of the women had trouble making the transition. This is the story of their lifetime. And emotionally, even though Frankie didn't have PTSD like the others, she did not forget it. She went back, and as you said, because of her very influential family, she was invited to the event almost of the century. And she's going there reluctantly, and then she runs into Robert McNamara, and she's devastated. This is the architect of the war that she saw destroying this country, and she can't stand it. She eventually goes to live in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, away from New York and society, so she can write her book, Fire in the Lake. And Katrine had a similar problem.
Went to Woodstock. Or was that Catherine?
That's Katrine.
That's
Katrine, she had a similar problem, and she had trouble just crossing the streets of Paris. She'd lost all her bearings. And this is common. So she finally accepted a photo assignment in the United States in New York, and you just gave it away, Eric. It was it was Woodstock, and she said, "That's it. I'm putting my camera away. I'm going to get into this." And she found some Vietnam vets who would now the Marines with long hair and smoking dope. And that helped her begin to figure out how she's going to live her life.
And there was a follow-up from Jennifer Deaton. What was the hardest part about writing the book?
The hardest part was being true to all of the material I had and not elaborating.
Okay.
Not putting words in their mouths, not making up cute little insinuations, letting the story tell itself, which, you know, we all know that everybody's favorite book about Vietnam is The Quiet American, written in 1955. And the reason it is because it's a story. And so, you know, that it's in the rear mirror of anybody who's writing about Vietnam. You know, you want a coherent story, but you're not writing a novel. So that was the hardest part, is to let the women tell their own story and to find the right letters. I mean, at one point when I had to write about what could be boring, Frances FitzGerald writing a book, you know, she goes to the library and she writes a book. So I said, okay, so who was your boyfriend? I interviewed her. Frankie's the only one who's still alive. And she said, oh, well, Alan Lelchuk. And I'd never heard of him before. I found Alan Lelchuk, and he brought the dynamism I needed for that part. And that's what I kept finding writing. I had to be true to the women and find those bits and pieces. So that was easily the most difficult.
I have a question from Peter Bozar, a member of the club. And I mean, you've been in that situation, and obviously in Cambodia, it was pretty extreme. But he said, to what extent do you think journalists can be truly objective, covering something as horrific as war? And to what extent do they end up choosing sides, whether it's intentional or not?
I find for these women, first I'm going to answer for these women. Catherine comes from an extremely right-wing, a right-wing nationalistic French family. So she arrives knowing that her father and her father was very sad that the French couldn't control it, and so that's where she comes. By the end of the war, she thinks she identifies with the Vietnamese people in neither side. She does not go pro-American. At the same time, she thinks that the communists really don't have all the support they say they are. So her last big piece, she says, the majority of the people, at least 60%, don't take either sides, and it's destroying the country. Kate, often it depended on which army she was just following. I mean, she was so, so I would say she did not have a high opinion of either army. And Frankie, you know, had respect for the government because she's, you know, she's the child thereof of the Americans, but she felt she had to warn. Her objectivity was to say, I have to take off my patriotic blinders, because in those days, the war was covered, saying the Americans were making mistakes, but never questioning why the Americans were there. And thus, so that's an objectivity, but she was accused of being anti-war because of it. So objective. I think once you see the pain and the destruction and the horror of war, your motivation is to be as more objective, not less. I mean, I remember my first, you know, when I was covering the war in '74, I had one week where I had my two biggest stories. The first was how the United States military attachés were illegally helping the Cambodian army, which was against the law. Americans were furious at that. The next one was describing as best I could who are the Khmer Rouge, because no one had done a big piece on it. And I said Solat Sar is a leader. He's the guy you know as Pol Pot. That was the first time his name was in the paper. I said he's ruthless and you know, to be, I don't know how much I knew about, but he was ruthless, et cetera, and that he was not happy with the Vietnamese. So that story, the American embassy was happy with, because it showed that the Khmer Rouge were to be feared. So was I being objective? Yeah. Did I make people happy? Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Mhm.
I think war is making more objective.
And I have a question from our former FCC president, Jody Schneider, who sent a message in from a question in from New York. She said, do you think many news organizations going forward will invest in this kind of coverage? And what does that mean for the future of war reporting? What would you advise young people who aspire to a career like yours? I mean, I teach a class at Baptist University on conflict reporting, and I really wonder what are the prospects for somebody that wants, I mean, unfortunately, there still are conflicts. So how do you see conflict reporting now?
Well, it's not, Jody's right. It's an iffy proposition. There's not the money there used to be. But the interest, at least in the United States, was generally on wars where Americans were fighting. So the interest in non-American wars is less. Without the money, you take too many risks as a freelancer. And those risks are higher than when I was a freelancer. So what would I say to a person? I would say, start with local journalism. That's as necessary right now as foreign. And if you do foreign, try not to do freelance. I think we're going to see more coverage from the people who live in the country. So Syrians covering Syria, whatever, if that's possible, but it's not in a good shape. Foreign coverage in conflict zones is not in a good shape. And the more who are killed or captured, I mean, journalists are now considered targets instead of by too many of the armies.
I mean, just going back to Cambodia and your book, When the War Was Over, what was your takeaway from that whole horror? I mean, you were there before, and then you met this man who was killed. I mean, I think you described seeing heads on spikes, like heads on, yes, walking into Phnom Penh, and you went on this tour, and then when did you meet Pol Pot?
At the end of 1978, when he was still in power. Right. So,
I mean, what was your takeaway as a journalist, being exposed to that? I mean, how do you kind of process that experience and then explain it to an audience?
Well, I never covered another war, if that makes it, if that tells you something. Okay. It's very hard. And when people say I'm a war correspondent, I say, well, I was a Cambodia correspondent in a sense. I did not want to cover another war. It was too much, and it was very hard. Therapy and all that. But remember, in those days, PTS didn't exist as a phenomena, and soldiers they knew had combat issues, but they're not journalists. So, the process, the best for me in a sense was writing the book.
Okay.
Writing the book, having to figure it out. That was it. That was very important. And
how about, I mean, you said that Frances FitzGerald kind of came out of it, but the self-medication of Catherine Leroy and Kate, that weighed heavily in their lives, didn't it?
Yeah, and
I mean, I witnessed it personally with Kate. So
everybody did, yeah. It was sad. And if anyone dared bring it up, she would shut them down. And didn't matter how close, family, friends, it was impossible. And Katrine became, well, Kate was always surrounded by friends and was a functional alcoholic. Kate burned out. I mean, Katrine, I'm sorry. Katrine Leroy burned out. And at one stage she had to have used clothing, high-end used clothing business in order to survive. But I have to say, as sad and lonely as it seemed, when she died, what was remarkable was that her friends got together, raised money to put together a wonderful foundation in order to collect all of her papers, all of her photographs, and make sure that her legacy was preserved. And they were, it was fundamental for me doing my research. And I kept saying, Katrine would have been so amazed that her friends cared that deeply for her and did that for her. So they suffered, but there was no question among the people that they left that legacy, both of them.
I mean, the sort of subtitle of your book is How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War. How would you say they rewrote the story of war?
They expanded the lens. They looked at the country and the people. There was a humanity to them that was missing. For instance, even scholars pointed to Frankie's book saying that changed their whole view of the war. Reporters looked to Kate, women in particular, said they got their jobs. They talked their editors into letting them to do things that they didn't want them to do because Kate showed it. And as I tried to show through the readings, that was remarkable in the era, that they brought people to life. They told the stories of the countries. They said the war is in a country. It's not just the narrowness of the battlefield and the policymakers. And so that's the rewriting of war, the humanity of it and the scope of it, digging deep.
And do you think it was worth the price they paid personally for it?
Oh, I wouldn't answer that. I mean,
I mean, it's the same for, look at all war correspondents. They're all wounded in some way, but you've got to get the story out, right?
Well, they were remarkable women, and Kate, for her funeral, she left specific instructions. And the one instruction was that when she's buried, she wanted to have Edith Piaf singing, Je ne regrette rien. I regret nothing. And Katrine, the last conversation she had was, I went to the summit. My Vietnam, I went to the summit. I know what it was. And Frankie, just this past year, won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Historical Society for her lifelong writing, not just the Vietnam book, but many other books that brought that same intense intelligence and humanity. So their lives were extraordinary. They paid a high price, but their lives, well, and Frankie's continues to be so. I'll let them tell.
Yeah. And if
I'll
you
let
read
them
the
have
book, one question we always finish with at the FCC, what are you reading now, Elizabeth? We always like to hear what our guests are reading. What would you recommend? Any recommended reading? And it doesn't have to be about war journalism.
Well, I recently read John Barry's book about the 1918 influenza epidemic, which I recommend.
Oh, right. It's not too depressing, no.
Well, you got to know what you're in for.
Yeah.
And because of the mess we're in here in the United States, I read, I've been reading about America's racial reckoning and our divisions. And it goes from Gore Vidal's novel about Lincoln to a recent one on, it's so recent it went in one ear and out the other. So it's been nothing to do with war, although I do have Viet Thanh Nguyen's new novel on my Kindle.
Do you ever are you still in touch with anybody from the Cambodian years?
Oh, yes. And I go back regularly. And in fact, some Cambodian friends have logged into my, on this virtual tour. So yeah, very much a part. And my gosh, they're going through another horrible time. Yeah. That your neighborhood, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, please, Hong Kong.
Yeah. You want the
no,
list?
I keep it. No, I keep in touch with some, Cambodians. Yeah, absolutely. Very important.
Okay, good. So I think everybody who's watched tonight is just, this is such a compelling story. So Elizabeth, thank you. You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War. I would highly recommend it. And I also think that the book you wrote, When the War Was Over, about Cambodia is definitely something that should be read as well. And so much of this stuff is relevant today. So I'd just like to thank you. Thank you for everybody for joining. And hopefully we'll see you in Hong Kong. We keep saying this, hopefully post-pandemic, we'll welcome you at the bar and we can raise a glass to Kate Webb, who she's still a celebrated member of the club.
Yeah. Yep.
Thanks,
Well,
Elizabeth.
thank you, Eric. Thank you. And thank everyone in the club. I enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.